All right, we can begin. So please open to Genesis chapter 15. And again, this is a very important passage earlier in the chapter, in verses 5 and 6, where we clearly see the idea of justification by faith for Abraham, and then Paul and James and others apply it to all men. And then after that, we have seemingly a bit of a strange passage. So in verse 7, the Lord said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And then Abraham says in verse 8, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And again, he's not doubting God's promise. He's simply asking for a confirmation or a sign. And so then, beginning in verse 9, God tells him to take a heifer, a she-goat, and a ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And then in verse 10, he's to divide the three animals in half and make two rows. But the birds he doesn't divide in half. He puts a turtle dove in one row, a young pigeon in the other row. So he makes two rows. And then in verse 11, fowls come down and try to eat the carcasses, and Abraham drives them away. And that's prophetic of the fact that we saw some passages that fowls in the Word of God are sometimes associated with devils and the Antichrist and Satan. So that's prophetic of them attacking God's covenant. And then verse 12 says that the sun went down and a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and an horror of great darkness fell upon him. So that is prophetic of that future time of great tribulation in Israel, followed by the day of the Lord. And then verse 13, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And so that is prophetic. God is telling Abraham that his seed is going to be in bondage in Egypt for 400 years. He doesn't name Egypt here, but later, of course, we learn that he's referring to Egypt. So that we all have talked about, including we went through the 400 years and how that all works out. So now we will move on to verse 14, chapter 15 in Genesis, and verse 14. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. So in verse 14, he says, and also that nation whom they shall serve. So they're going to be afflicted in a nation for 400 years, and they will serve that nation. And so, as I mentioned, many passages in the Old Testament have an immediate or historical fulfillment, that the passage was fulfilled at that time or soon after the prophecy was given, sometime during the Old Testament years. But then in addition to that, many times they also have another future fulfillment in the last days. So some talk about a double fulfillment, whatever term we want to use. And I believe that's the case here also. So in verse 14, where it says, and also that nation whom they shall serve. So historically, that is referring again to that they will be in Egypt. They will serve in Egypt. And so we can read the details about this in Exodus chapter 1 and 2. But then I believe prophetically, excuse me, I believe prophetically, this also prophesies about them serving Babylon. So turn to Isaiah chapter 14. And there are quite a number of passages regarding Israel serving Babylon later in their history. So Isaiah chapter 14 and beginning in verse 1. For the Lord shall have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land. And the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave
to the house of Jacob. And the people shall take them, and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them
in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids, and they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. And it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow, and from thy fear, and from the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve. So notice the end of verse 3, it speaks of the hard bondage wherein thou wast made to serve. And so, of course, that took place earlier in Egypt, but this is now prophetic of Babylon. So, verse 4, that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked, and the scepter of the rulers. So this is one of the passages prophesying that in the last days, Israel will again serve a foreign nation and be in bondage to a foreign nation. And in this case, it's Babylon. Then look in Jeremiah chapter 5. Jeremiah chapter 5 and beginning in verse 19. And it shall come to pass when ye shall say, wherefore doth the Lord our God all these things unto us? Doeth the Lord our God all these things unto us? Then shalt thou answer them, like as ye have forsaken me, and served strange gods in your land, so shall ye serve strangers in a land that is not yours. Declare this in the house of Jacob, and publish it in Judah, saying, hear now this, O foolish people, and without understanding, which have eyes and see not, which have ears and hear not. And so again, it prophesies here of the fact that they're going to be strangers in another land, and again, in this case, Babylon. Then look in chapter 17 in Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 4. And thou, even thyself, shalt discontinue from thine heritage that I gave thee, and I will cause thee to serve thine enemies in the land which thou knowest not. For ye have kindled a fire in mine anger, which shall burn forever. So again, Jeremiah says that the Israelites will serve thine enemies in the land which thou knowest not.
Again, referring to Babylon. Then chapter 27 is Jeremiah.
Jeremiah chapter 27 and beginning in verse 9. Therefore hearken not ye to your prophets, nor to your diviners, nor to your dreamers, nor to your enchanters, nor to your sorcerers, which speak unto you, saying, ye shall not serve the king of Babylon. For they prophesy a lie unto you, to remove you far from your land, and that I should drive you out, and ye should perish. So there will be false prophets in that day saying, you will not have to serve Babylon, or we will not serve Babylon. And he says in verse 10, they prophesy a lie unto you, because in fact they will have to serve Babylon. And then again in Jeremiah chapter 27 and verse 12. I spake also to Zebediah king of Judah according to all these words, saying, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Why will ye die, thou and thy people, by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, as the Lord hath spoken against the nation that will not serve the king of Babylon? And so, in fact, Jeremiah warns them not to resist serving the king of Babylon, not to believe the lie that they won't have to serve them, but also not even to resist serving the king of Babylon. Okay, then go back to Exodus chapter 15. So in Exodus chapter 15 and verse 14, where it says, and also that nation whom they shall serve, again, historically, that is referring to them serving in Egypt for 400 years. But prophetically, I believe it refers to them serving Babylon, which we've just seen several passages telling us that they will serve Babylon. Okay, and then in Genesis chapter 15, verse 14, it continues and it says, will I judge? So that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And so historically, this speaks of God's judgment upon Egypt with the plagues. So we can read great detail about this in Exodus chapter 7 through chapter 14. It gives details of all the plagues that God
brought upon Egypt. Prophetically, it speaks of God's judgment upon Babylon. So, for example, Jeremiah chapter
51. So historically, they were in bondage in Egypt, and then God judged Egypt. Prophetically, they will be in bondage to Babylon, and then God will judge Babylon. So, for example, Jeremiah chapter 51, and beginning in verse 1. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up against Babylon, and against them that dwell in the midst of them that rise up against me, a destroying wind, and will send unto Babylon fanners that shall fan her, and shall empty her land. For in the day of trouble they shall be against her round about. Against him that bendeth, let the archer bend his bow. And against him that lifteth himself up in his brigandine, and spare ye not her young men. Destroy ye utterly all her host. Thus the slain shall fall in the land of the Chaldeans, and they that are thrust through in her streets. For Israel hath not been forsaken, nor Judah of his God, of the Lord of hosts. Through their land was filled with, though their land was filled with sin against the Holy One of Israel. And so this speaks of how God will judge Babylon. And then also look in the book of Revelation, chapter 18. And this is another fairly lengthy passage of how God at that time will judge Babylon. So Revelation chapter 18, and beginning in verse 1. And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. So this, I'm reading this because it is prophetic of the fall of Babylon. But also notice in verse 2, the mention of it's the habitation of devils, and then it says the hold of every foul spirit. So there's the fowls, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. So this is one of the
where fowls or birds are related to Satan and the devils. Okay, then continuing in
verse 3. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And then the passage continues, again talking about how God will judge Babylon. Okay, then again back to Genesis chapter 15. And again in verse 14, he says, And also that nation whom they shall serve, historically Egypt, prophetically Babylon, will I judge. He judged Egypt, he will judge Babylon. And then verse 14 says, And afterward shall they come out with great substance. So historically, that speaks of Israel coming out of Egypt with many riches. And if you look in Exodus chapter 12, we can see where this was fulfilled. Exodus chapter 12, and beginning in verse 34. Exodus chapter 12, verse 34. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. So, as was prophesied in Genesis 15 to Abraham, it says, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. So when the Israelites left Egypt, they went out with much gold and silver and raiment and other provisions. So that's the historic fulfillment. Then prophetically, after the destruction of Babylon, Israel will again be enriched by the Gentiles. So, for example, Isaiah chapter
1. Isaiah chapter 61.
and beginning in verse 4. And they shall build the old wastes, they shall raise up the former desolations, and they shall repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations. And strangers shall stand and feed your flocks, and the sons of the alien shall be your plowmen and your vine dressers. But ye shall be named the priests of the Lord. Men shall call you the ministers of our God. Ye shall eat the riches of the Gentiles. So notice that in verse 6. Ye shall eat the riches of the Gentiles, and in their glory shall ye boast yourselves. Okay, then back to Genesis chapter 15. So Genesis chapter 15 and verse 14, God tells Abraham that they're going to serve a foreign nation, and then God will judge that foreign nation, and then they will receive great substance, great riches from that foreign nation. And again, historically, all of that concerns Egypt. Prophetically, it concerns also Babylon. All right, then Genesis chapter 15 and verse 15. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. So after speaking about Abram's descendants, his seed, in verse 14, now in verse 15, God turns his attention directly to Abram himself. So he tells Abram in verse 15 that he will go to thy fathers. So in other words, Abram will die. So if there is any doubt before this in Abram's mind that he would die, he now clearly knows that he will. That phrase in verse 15, go to thy fathers, that does not mean that that he's saying that Abram will spend eternity in the same place as his fathers, because in fact that's not true. Look in Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2. And Joshua said unto all the people, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, your
other side of the flood in old time, even Terah,
Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. So as we've talked about previously, Abraham's fathers were idolaters. And so here's where we learn that. So back in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 15, when he tells Abram, and thou shalt go to thy fathers, he's not making a statement there that Abram will spend eternity in the same place as his fathers, who were idolaters. It simply means that, like his fathers, Terah, Nahor, Serug, etc., Abram will die. And then in verse 15, he continues and he tells Abram that he will go to his fathers or he will die in peace. So I believe Abram knew that God had imputed righteousness unto him, as we read and talked about in verse 6. And he believed in the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. So without that righteousness, Abraham could not die in peace. But having that righteousness imputed to him or counted to him, he now is able to die in peace. And then in verse 15, God told Abraham that he would be buried in a good old age. So in this case, what is a good old age? Look in chapter 25 in Genesis. Genesis chapter 25 and verse 7. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 163 years. So Abraham lived 175 years. And then he died in peace and was buried in a good old age. Okay, then again back to Genesis 15. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So, excuse me, in verse 16, God tells Abram that in the fourth generation, his seed or his descendants
will come back into the land of Canaan. So in verse 16, in the fourth generation, they shall come hither again, come back again into the land of Canaan.
So Jacob went into Egypt in Genesis chapter 4.
So then, if we look at these generations, look in Genesis 29.
29. Genesis chapter 29 and verse 34. And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore was his name called Levi. So Jacob had a son named Levi. So this would be the first generation that served in Egypt. And then turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 6. First Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 1. So the sons of Levi, so again Levi being in this case the first generation, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So notice in First Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 1 that Levi had a son named Kohath. So that would be the second generation. And then verse 2 in First Chronicles 6, and the sons of Kohath, Amram, Ishar, and Hebron, and Gaziel. So notice in verse 2 that Kohath had a son named Amram. So that would be the third generation. And then 1 Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 3, and the children of Amram, Aaron and Moses and Miriam, the sons also of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. Okay, so notice in verse 3 that Amram had a son named Moses. And so that would be the fourth generation. All right, then go back to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16. But in the fourth generation, they shall come hither again. So in the fourth generation, which as we just saw is a generation of Moses, Israel left Egypt and they came back into the land of Canaan, just as God told Abram here in Genesis 15. And so why was there this long delay in the Israelites coming back into the land of Canaan?
400 years in Egypt before coming back into Canaan.
And God told Abram the reason in chapter 15 and verse 16 was that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. All right, so who are the Amorites? Look back in Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 15. And Canaan begat Sidon his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite. So the Amorites were descendants of Canaan, and they were inhabitants in the land of Canaan. So when Abram came into the land, there were Amorites. The Amorites were among the people living in the land. And then look in chapter 14 in Genesis. And we went through chapter 14 in detail recently. But let me remind you, Genesis chapter 14 and verse 13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. So when Abraham was gathering up the army in Genesis 14, the Amorites joined Abram in this battle, and so we've seen some evidence of the Amorites in the land and their involvement previously with Abram. But now in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16, he says that the Egyptians are going to have to serve in Egypt and be in bondage in Egypt for until the fourth generation. And why is that? In verse 16, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So this explains God's timing concerning the exodus from Egypt. God waited until the iniquity of the Amorites was full. And then he delivered Israel out of Egypt and brought them into the land. And then he used Joshua to destroy the Amorites. So look in Joshua chapter 2.
Joshua chapter 2.
And verse 10. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when ye came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. So God used Joshua to destroy these two kings of the Amorites. And then also chapter 3 in Joshua, chapter 3 and verse 10. And Joshua said, hereby ye shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Hittites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Jebusites. So again, God used Joshua to drive out the Amorites. And then you can go back to Genesis chapter 15. So the military campaigns of Joshua, when they entered into the land, were not, as some would have us believe, they were not just vicious, brutal acts of aggression, but rather they were acts of justice ordered by God. Because the Amorites and these other people had become very wicked. And also, we studied some weeks ago that in many of these cases, there were giants in those places. And so that's why God had Joshua come in and destroy them and carry out the justice of God. But God waited patiently until the iniquity of the Amorites was full. Okay, and then back in Genesis chapter 15. And verse 17. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. So the time came earlier, we saw back in in verse 12, the sun was going down, and a deep sleep fell upon Abram.
And lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. In verse 13, 14, 15.
Now in verse 17, the time came when the sun went down and it was dark. And so, as we talked about, when we talked about verse 12, that darkness and the sun going down has to do prophetically with Israel's time of great tribulation and followed by the day of the Lord. So in the more immediate context, it speaks, verse 17 speaks of the affliction of Abram's seed that they would undergo in Egypt. But again, prophetically, it's looking to the future. Look in Jeremiah chapter 34. And this is a very, very important and helpful passage for us to understand what's going on there in Genesis 15. So Jeremiah chapter 34, and beginning in verse 17. Therefore thus saith the Lord, ye have not hearkened unto me in proclaiming liberty, every one to his brother, and every man to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim a liberty for you, saith the Lord, to the sword, to the pestilence, and to the famine. And I will make you to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, which have not performed the words of the covenant which they had made before me, when they cut the calf in twain and passed between the parts thereof. So notice here in Jeremiah we have something similar to what we're reading in Genesis. So at the end of verse 18, they cut the calf in twain, in two, and then they laid them out, made two rows, and then they passed between the parts of the calves. And then continuing in verse 19, the princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests and all the people of the land, which passed between the parts of the calf. So again, you have there the calf cut in two, and then they pass between the two rows. Verse 20, I will even give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of them that seek their life, and their dead bodies shall be for meat unto the fowls of the heaven and to the beasts of the earth. So there again,
verse 21, and Zedekiah the king of Judah and his princes
will I give into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of them that seek their life, and into the hand of the king of Babylon's army, which are gone up from you. So in this passage in Jeremiah 34, the men passed between the pieces of the calf that had been cut in two. But back in Genesis chapter 15, and looking at verse 17, it was only the smoking furnace and the burning lamp that passed between the pieces. So Abram did not walk between the pieces because God put Abram into a deep sleep. So he could not walk between the pieces. So again, in Genesis 15 and verse 17, it was, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between these pieces. So this is very significant, because normally when two parties are making a covenant, both parties would pass between the pieces, signifying that they would keep the terms of the covenant, that both parties would do their part in keeping the terms of the covenant. But in this case, here in Genesis chapter 15, only God passed between the pieces, in the sense of the smoking furnace and the burning lamp. So the fire and the smoke here in Genesis 15 are both speak of the presence of God. So, for example, look in Exodus chapter 13. So when it talks about the smoking furnace and the burning lamp passing between the pieces, that's telling us that God passed between the pieces. So Exodus chapter 13 and verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lend them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light to go by day and night. So clearly here, this pillar of fire, this is God leading them. And so this fire speaks of the presence of God. And then also look in chapter 19.
Exodus chapter 19 and verse 18. And Mount Sinai
was all together on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. So this is when Moses was given the commandments, and so the Lord came down on Mount Sinai, and notice in verse 18, the mount was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace. And so all of this language speaks of the presence of God. Okay, then you can go back to Genesis 15. So in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 17, again, it tells us that Abram did not pass between the pieces. And again, he couldn't, because God put Abram into a deep sleep. And then God alone passed through the pieces, his presence being seen by the smoking furnace and the lamp of light. And so that signified that this was an unconditional covenant. It was a one-sided covenant. So again, many covenants are between two parties, and there are conditions placed on each of the two parties, and each of the two parties must keep the terms of the covenant. But in this case, it was a one-sided covenant, an unconditional covenant, because Abram never passed through the pieces. He never agreed to any kind of conditions or terms. And so that's the significance of what we read in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 17. Look in Genesis chapter 31. Genesis chapter 31 and beginning in verse 43. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children,
which they have borne? Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant. So
Laban wants to make a covenant with Jacob. Continuing in verse 44, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. And Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. And so this is an example of usually how covenants are made. So two parties agree to make a covenant, and each party has certain conditions or certain terms that they must meet. But in Genesis chapter 15, that's why God put Abram into a deep sleep. So Abram could not pass between the pieces. So only God passed between the pieces. And so again, this was a one-party covenant. God alone guaranteed the fulfillment of this covenant. He placed no conditions on Abraham or his seed. And so we have these two things in verse 17, the smoking furnace and a burning lamp. So the smoking furnace speaks of suffering. And so historically, again, it spoke of Israel's being afflicted in Egypt, their suffering in Egypt. Prophetically, it speaks of, excuse me, it speaks of Israel's future suffering in their time of great tribulation. So look at Deuteronomy chapter 4. So we want to, as we read a few verses here, we want to take note of language related to this smoking furnace. Okay, so first of all, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 20. But the Lord hath taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance, as ye are this day. So Egypt here is referred to as an iron furnace. And then 1 Kings chapter 8. First Kings chapter 8, and we want verse 51. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 51.
Okay, verse 51. For they be thy people and thine inheritance.
Thou broughtest forth out of Egypt from the midst of the furnace of iron. So again, Egypt here is called the furnace of iron. And then look in Isaiah chapter 31. So historically, Egypt was that smoking furnace where the Israelites would have to suffer. Okay, then Isaiah chapter 31, and beginning in verse 8. Then shall the Assyrian, and that's the Antichrist, then shall the Assyrian fall with a sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword not of a mean man, shall devour him. But he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited. And he shall pass over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the ensign, saith the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and his furnace in Jerusalem. So here is the Lord's furnace, and it's in Jerusalem. And then Jeremiah chapter 11. Jeremiah chapter 11 and beginning in verse 3. And say thou unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Cursed be the man that obeyeth not the words of this covenant, which I commanded your fathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt from the iron furnace, saying, Obey my voice and do them, according to all which I command you, so shall ye be my people, and I will be your God. So once again, it refers here to Egypt as the iron furnace. And then one more in the book of Ezekiel and chapter 22. So all these verses help us to understand that smoking furnace in Genesis 15 that passed between the pieces. All right, Ezekiel chapter 22 and beginning in verse 18. Son of man, the house of Israel is to me become dross. All they are brass and tin and iron and lead in the midst of the furnace. They are even the dross of silver.
Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, because ye are all become dross, behold, therefore,
I will gather you into the midst of Jerusalem, as they gather silver and brass and iron and lead and tin into the midst of the furnace, to blow the fire upon it, to melt it. So will I gather you in mine anger and in my fury, and I will leave you there and melt you. Okay, then go back to Genesis chapter 15. So the smoking furnace in Genesis chapter 15 that passed between the pieces is again talking about the presence of God passing between the pieces, and it has to do with the suffering that Israel will go through, but then also the suffering that God will bring upon Israel's enemies. And then the burning lamp in verse 17 speaks of the glory. So the smoking furnace speaks of the suffering, the burning lamp speaks of the glory. So historically, the burning lamp speaks of Israel's deliverance from Egypt and her entrance into the land of Canaan. Prophetically, the burning lamp speaks of Israel's deliverance from the Antichrist and then her entrance into the kingdom. So let's just quickly read some verses and then we'll conclude today. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 21. And so in these verses, we are looking for references regarding this burning lamp. All right, so 2 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 17. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, succored him and smote the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David sware unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, and that thou quench not the light of Israel. So notice here the light of Israel. And then 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 36. And unto his son will I give one tribe, that David my servant may have a light all the way before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen me to put my name there. So notice again the mention there of the light in Jerusalem. And then 1 Kings
and verse 4. Nevertheless,
for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem to set up his son after him and to establish Jerusalem. So David's given a lamp in Jerusalem. And then a couple more, Isaiah chapter 62. Isaiah chapter 62 and verse 1. For Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth. So here's the lamp that burneth. And then we'll conclude with Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 1. Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins which took their lamps and went forth to meet the bridegroom. So those are some references to the light and to the lamp. So the smoking furnace passed between the two pieces, and the burning lamp passed between the pieces, again telling us that this covenant is an unconditional covenant. God alone is responsible for the fulfillment of this covenant. And before this covenant is fulfilled, there will first be suffering, the smoking furnace, and then there will be glory, the burning lamp. All right, thank you all, and we will stop there for today.